Hi, everybody. This is Saad. Today I have the pleasure of hosting Konstantin. Am I saying it right? Is it Konstantin or Constantin? In French, we'd say Constantin, but how would you
Yeah,
say it?
I'm not French, so I would say Konstantin.
Konstantin Kisin, who is the author of a new book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, which we'll get into. Also, the co host with Francis Foster of TRIGGERnometry, and we'll get into some of the content of that very successful podcast later in the chat. He's a Russian British comedian. You're also a member of the Evil Juice tribe, right? The Evil Juice.
Absolutely,
Yes,
extremely evil.
extremely evil. Uh, and I guess we'll just get going. Let's begin first with a congratulation. You recently extended your genes, also known as you had a baby, correct?
Yes, I did. I've got a 3 month old son, and it's incredible. It changes your perspective on so many things that I did not expect.
Give us some of those. Like, what are some concrete ways by which your perspectives have changed?
Well, I think first of all, it forces you to step up to another level of adulthood where your focus of attention becomes external instead of internal. And that was happening for me for some time anyway, because running trigonometry, we now have a bunch of employees and it's sort of my job to manage the team. So they were kind of like a family that I was looking after anyway. But when it's your baby and they're as helpless as a baby is, it changes the nature of everything. So I find that my attitude to other people has become softer as well, because I see that they were once this perfect and completely helpless thing too. So it's made me a bit softer and kinder, I think, which probably wasn't entirely unwelcome.
I can offer you an evolutionary explanation for that softer, and kinder spirit. You,
Mm,
you ready?
yes.
So it turns out that when fathers are expecting a child or shortly thereafter having a child, as you do, they have a rather precipitous drop in their testosterone. And so one of the arguments for that is that to the extent that we all have multiple Darwinian pulls, right? We have a mating drive, we have a parental drive. Well, you now need to shift a lot more of your attention to your parental drive and a lot less spending 95% of your day thinking about sex. And one of the ways that nature has assured that is by having a drop in your libidinal hormonal profile, which is testosterone.
That's very interesting. You're basically saying I've become less of a man. Thanks, Kat. Uh,
Only temporarily.
only temporarily, right?
Now, here's the other bad news, of course. Every day that we age, our testosterone also goes down. So your testosterone and mine when we were 20 is not the same as, at least for me, when I'm 57. But don't worry about it. You have so much manhood in you that even if you had your drop by 50%, you're still beating most men. All right,
Yeah.
let's talk about an immigrant's love letter to the West. Tell us about it, and then we can drill down to different details.
Well, it's essentially, I mean, it does what it says on the cover. It's a book which explains and reminds people. You are fond of doing this yourself, Gad. We've had you on our show a couple of times, reminding people in the West that they're actually quite fortunate to be living here, and that if they were to spend a moment to compare their life in the West with the way that most people live around the world, or most of our ancestors have lived throughout history, they'd maybe take for granted the things that we have a little bit less and appreciate them a little bit more. And I'm really trying to reach, I don't think that the crazy people who've gone off the deep end can be reached at this point, and I'm not really particularly trying to reach them, but I think there's a sort of 80% of people in the middle who will go along with whatever the trend of the day is. And if you tell them that the trend of the day is, you need to put a black square on Instagram and apologize for being white and whatever, then they'll do that. And if you tell them that maybe that's not necessary, then they'll maybe not go along with that. So I just wanted to offer a bit of historical and geographical context for people living in the West. Someone who was born in the Soviet Union, whose family went through the gulags, I watched my grandparents be essentially forced out of the Soviet Union. They were sort of cancelled before that was cool for saying the wrong thing. I've seen all of this before, so I'm troubled by the direction of some of the changes and the shifts that are happening in Western society. But also, I believe that with the right adjustments, we can remain what we have been for decades now, which is the center of genuine progress, whether that's scientific or cultural or technological or musical or comedic or whatever. We can maintain that and grow that, provided we're willing to have an honest conversation about our past, about who we are, about values and things that matter. So that's really the book. And I, with my comedy background, I wanted to sweeten the medicine a little bit, so it's funny as well, and people can just enjoy reading it. But also, I'm concerned not only about the division and some of the sheer stupidity of some of these idea pathogens, as you call them, that we've been adopting in the West, but more importantly, I'm concerned that as we weaken ourselves, we have threats around the world and enemies around the world. We like to pretend this isn't the case, of course, but we do have enemies, and they are taking advantage. They are accelerating this division and this nonsense, and they're doing this because they know that it benefits them. It benefits Russia, it benefits China to see the West obsessing about, systemic this and whatever, internalize that, because it means that we've taken our eye off the ball. And while we're busy trying to define a woman, they're busy building weapons and expanding their power around the world. So that's where the book's coming from. I'm fortunate that a lot of people have read it. It's become a Sunday Times bestseller here in the UK. So it's resonated with a lot of people, and I'm really grateful for that.
So in my case, as you know from having read my stuff, and you've been kind enough to invite me on your show, as you said a couple of times. In my case, living in the university ecosystem is what allowed me to navigate and swim in this endless bullshit all day long, right? So it's clear in my case why it would be that I would have written The Parasitic Mind, because I'm infected by this stuff, or at least those ideas try to infect me every day for the past 30 years. In your case, what was the catalyst? Was it your comedy career where you were, exposed to political correctness? Or what was the catalyst that said, wait a minute, we've got a problem here?
Well, it's a couple of things, with three things, I would say. So the first one is, you're right, in comedy, around the time that I was starting to make my way in the comedy world, I saw this just very powerful trend, because as we all know, politics is downstream from culture. So the political shifts that we've all been talking about for the last 6 years, they were happening already in the cultural sphere before that. And so by 2015, 2016, particularly Brexit and Trump obviously had a big effect. But even before that, there was this sudden creeping. It wasn't just political correctness only. It wasn't just about censorship of material and self-censorship. It was also the second thing that I was going to say, which I have a deep disdain for identity politics in any form. And this is partly, I think, because of my Soviet background. I saw what happens when you say, these people are good, these people are bad, and you divide people into these groups. And it doesn't really matter. Obviously in the communist case, you divide people by class, and you say, these people are the downtrodden, the oppressed, the working class, and these people are the evil capitalist, pure, bourgeoisie oppressors. And that is enough to get you to kill 50 million people. But then you take this racial stuff and you start to play to people's ethnic, concerns. You start to go, well, you are white and you are black. That to me is a big concern. And I saw this in comedy. I saw, 20-year-old guys going on stage and going, oh, I'm a straight white man, therefore this. And I just saw this sort of seeping into the culture. And it really, really bothered me. It really bothered me. To me, this is a very dangerous way of thinking about the world. It's a very dangerous idea, and particularly in multi-ethnic societies like the ones that we have in Canada, in the US, and in the UK particularly, and in other countries too, of course, in the Anglosphere in particular. We are multi-ethnic societies, and that means we have to work that little bit extra hard to ensure that we have a harmonious society, because you'll know this way better than I do, of course. We are evolved to be tribal. We are evolved. The very hormones that make us bind to our group make us hostile to the out group. So we do have to work hard to make sure that we are a cohesive, coherent society. And so seeing people deliberately leaning into this racial and, by the way, gender divisiveness, the idea that men and women, two groups of people who've historically needed to work so much together just to survive. The idea that these people should be forced to engage in some sort of battle of the sexes is the most moronic thing I've ever heard. And again, this was happening. And the third thing, of course, with my again, Soviet background and the history of my family, seeing that some of these things are genuinely creeping into Western thinking and Western behavior. My grandfather, he was ostracized by his friends, fired from work. His wife was fired from work because he said that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was wrong. And he didn't say it during Stalin's period. He said it in the 1980s.
Wow.
And what happened to him, I mean, that's really not that different to somebody who says the wrong thing now. And lots of other things, political correctness, most people don't know, but it comes from the Soviet Union. That's where it was created. And the purpose of it was never to protect people from offense or to ensure politeness or to ensure that people were considerate to others. The purpose of political correctness was to say, well, what you're saying is true, but it's inconvenient to the party line. It is inconvenient to the dogma of the day. And so as I see that, form of censorship and oppression of our thinking take root, I'm kind of triggered by it. I'm not going to lie. It bothers me. And it bothers me that the West would choose to move in this direction. The redefinition of words, which has been very powerful, is again something very similar, because if you can change the meaning, look at the word, we've talked about this, of course, before, but, look at the meaning of something like safety. Safety does not mean the absence of physical violence, which it used to mean until 3 seconds ago. Safety now means that you are not expressing the ideas that I don't like.
Right.
Inclusion is the same. The most inclusive space is one where you and I would be extremely excluded in, and probably quite unsafe in the old definition of it. And on we go. So there are a few changes that are happening in society in the West that trouble me because they echo some of the things that I've seen. So it's the comedy, it's the racial and sexual divisiveness, and it's also the fact that we seem to be moving, at least in some pockets of our society, in a more communist direction.
Oh, great, all-encompassing answer. Now, let me ask you this. Did you discover your hunter badgerhood as a result of having to address these trends that were developing in the West? Or had you always, could you go back to when you were 6 where someone said something that you disagreed with and you stood up? Or is this a newly found ability?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of them. But I think if I'm honest, I love my dad and we have a great relationship now. But when I was born, my mum had been 18 for 4 days and my dad was 20. So they were very young. They didn't particularly know what they were doing. And my dad in particular, I think I would be accurate in saying he was a bit of a bully when I was a kid. And my childhood, my teenage years in particular, were sort of unstoppable force meets a movable object. That was kind of my relationship with my dad. And I developed this very strong sense that I refuse to bow to illegitimate authority. And when you're young, it's quite hard to distinguish between legitimate authority and illegitimate authority. So you're rebelling against everything. As you mature, hopefully, I hope I've been able to do that, you start to go, well, it's great that I have this deep sense of fairness and I care about people being treated fairly and I care about me being treated fairly too. And I'm going to fight to make sure that that happens, while also appreciating that not all authority is bad, not all structures are bad, etc. And that's kind of where I am now. I hope I resist very strongly attempts to brainwash me or to tell me that white is black and black is white when I can see it with my own eyes. And I come from generations of men and women who said no. Who said, no, I'm not going to lie. And if that means I end up in a camp, that's where I'm going to end up. But I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to bend the knee. I'm not going to pretend that the emperor is dressed when he's blatantly naked and quite ugly at that. I'm not going to do it. And so, I also feel that I owe it to them. And now, of course, we talked about my son being born. I have an example to set for him. I want him to grow up and be a man who stands up for the things that are right and refuses to pretend and go along with things that are wrong.
Well, I'm glad you brought back the issue of your son being born, because I've often in the past, when my children were born, my wife would say to me, why must you take on the mantle of every fight? And it's not for you to be, the savior and so on. And I said, well, first of all, I'm allergic to bullshit. So very much like you, how you get upset when you see untruth, I can't help but, intervene. But secondly, once you have children, you realize that you're not just fighting for your time span, right, lifespan. You're right. So if, for example, the West is being Islamized at a breathtaking, accelerating rate, then we can discuss whether it's a good thing for the West to be more Islamized, or would it be better if it were less Islamized, right? And I may be able to outrun it within my lifespan, but certainly my children won't be able to. So I think I agree with you that having children, as you said, allows you to refocus in all sorts of ways, and one of which is in how urgent it becomes to deal with a lot of these issues, because I don't want them to go through all these battles that I had to go through.
And the other piece to, I think, to parenthood as well is I want my children to see me and to see what it means to stand up for what you believe in, right? So I want to be an example to them of, as best I can. Of course, I'm not perfect, but I want to be an example to them of what it means to be honest and what it means to be truthful. And that actually we are fortunate, Gad, and I say this always, whenever we talk about, cancel culture and all of this, 500 years ago, people like me and you would have been burned at the stake. Now, actually, maybe for the first time in history, the short-term pain of standing up and saying no is actually quite often worth the long-term benefit of it, not just internally, but on a practical level, in terms of building an audience or building a YouTube show or building your audience as a comedian or whatever, being able to write books about things that matter to you and have people read those books and pay for them. We are, for the first time, I think, the dissidents and the heretics, we are allowed, for the most part, in the West at least, to survive the process and to benefit from this. So I want my children also to see that, you can be truthful and you will take the punishment initially, but you'll be rewarded in the long run. And I think that's the best way actually for people in the modern world to do what's right, is to show them that actually it then benefits you too. It makes it a lot easier to do the right thing if it actually benefits you in the long run too.
Well, I mean, you probably have heard this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? When you do something for intrinsic reasons, I'm taking this degree simply because I love learning. Whereas extrinsic would be I'm doing this degree because it's going to improve my lot in the job market, right? And when you intervene in the way that we do, there is the intrinsic reason, which is it's the right thing to do. But as you said, the extrinsic reason is that if you look at history is not shaped by equivocating fence sitters, right? History is shaped, for better or worse, by people who are dogmatic, opinionated. And I don't mean to imply that if you weigh in on these issues, you have to be a dogmatic, asshole. But the world is shaped, right? I mean, Hitler shaped the world through the most vile of ways, but he was certainly taking a position. Christopher Hitchens is revered the way that he is because he takes positions and he doesn't suffer fools gladly. So if you're looking at an intrinsic reason to build your YouTube channel, have a better career, you're never going to do it by being an equivocating fence sitter.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get into that when we get round to talking about the Sam Harris situation.
Yes,
because
we will.
you may find that I am more of a what did you say? What kind of fence sitter?
Equivocating fence sitter.
I don't know if I'm an equivocating fence sitter, but we'll see. We'll see what comes out of that conversation.
Okay. Well, so let's hold off on that for a second. Do you want to discuss at all your comedy background? Because you told me offline that you're not doing as much, if at all, any stand-up comedy. Why is that, by the way?
Well, so up until the pandemic, I was doing stand-up, and it meant basically most people don't realize this, but certainly in the UK, being a stand-up comedian means that you drive around for hours every day to a gig and back. So usually my day looked like I'd be doing trigonometry stuff all day during the day, jump in the car at 5 o'clock, get to the show at 7, and I'd be home by midnight, 1 o'clock at best. So and it was it was killing my health. My marriage was getting close to the point where, the baby that we have now wasn't going to be around, and maybe neither was my wife, who's a treasure for me. And we've been together since we were very young. And it's our relationship was the most valuable thing to me. And when the pandemic hit, we started doing what we call raw shows. So we have Trigonometry, the interviews, which you've done. And we also do a raw show, which is very offensive, outrageous, commentary on the news, comedic, and Francis and I sit there and joke about all sorts of stuff. We do every accent under the sun. read loads of articles, talk about what's going on in our lives. And so the comedic outlet is still there, but the desire to drive to a gig 3 hours drive away every night to stand on stage in front of a few hundred people or whatever, that's completely gone. I get the creative outlet through the raw shows that we have, and the downsides of the comedy lifestyle are just I can't do it anymore. So yeah, but I really enjoyed my stand-up career, and I'm not saying it's over. What I'm saying is I'm on a break, and if that break lasts the rest of my life, then so be it.
Right. I had a postdoc at one point, a postdoctoral student whose doctoral dissertation was on the evolutionary roots of comedy, of humor. The idea being that humor is a sexually selected trait. Well, not humor per se, but intelligence is a sexually selected trait. And so to the extent that we often hear women saying that, I'm really attracted to a funny guy, they are effectively saying by proxy that they're attracted to an intelligent guy, because it's difficult to be truly witty, truly sarcastic, satirical, funny if you're dull as a doorknob, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Has that been your experience anecdotally, that all of the comedians that you meet tend to be rather intelligent folks?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. Violating
no,
the... Okay.
But I also agree with you. So I think there are a lot of people in the comedy industry who would like to be attractive to women by being funny. That does not necessarily mean that they are funny or that they are intelligent. But yeah, I think the best comedians are undoubtedly have a certain form of intelligence, I would say, that is valuable. And when we had Diana Fleischman on our show,
yes,
an evolutionary psychologist, too, she made this point as well, that it's all about increasing your attractiveness to the opposite sex for men.
Yeah, exactly.
In particular. And I do think it's true. Comedy, generally speaking, the comedy industry, it's a little bit different in the United States because the type of humor is different in the United States. But in Britain, the comedy industry is essentially 99% beta males who want to get laid. Yeah. Like, as characters, I don't mean that they're, they may off stage, they may be something else,
right?
But probably not. But generally, that tends to be the way it works. It's also because of the British sense of humor too. The British sense of humor is particularly dependent on the comedian being the fall guy. In America, the comedy can be like, I am the hero that looks at the world and points out the hypocrisies, and that's kind of more the comedy that I used to do, actually. But in Britain, the most popular type of comedy is, look how fat I am, look how stupid I am, look how it's
a form of self-deprecation.
Self-deprecation to the extreme level.
Do you have a thought as to why that cross-cultural difference in humor styles has evolved to be the way that it is in the US versus Britain?
I don't know why it evolved to be that way. I mean, I have some theories on that, I would say. I think, so America is a young country. Is kind of like a teenager, right? And the teenager is, he's out there, he's trying to do stuff, he wants to look cool, and Britain is an old country, it's had its empire, and it's sort of a little bit, it's lost the testosterone, let's say, coming back to earlier conversation. So, and in Britain, there's a culture of, you mustn't stand out tall poppy syndrome. This is when we were on Joe Rogan with Francis a few weeks ago. This is one of the things we talked about a lot. One of the things I really like about America is there's this sort of go-get-it attitude, and people will support you if they see you doing well. In the UK, less so. And in Ireland, they even have the saying, Ireland has, its own culture and very rich culture, but it's got it's tinged with British history for obvious reasons. They have the saying, if you start thinking that you're good and successful and whatever, they say, you've got the notions of, grandeur or whatever it is. So we have this thing in the UK where you mustn't stand out too much. You mustn't think too much of yourself. You've got to always pretend. It's interesting. I don't know if you know Bridget Fettersey.
I do.
I love Bridget so much. And one of the things she asks all her guests is, what is your greatest strength and your greatest weakness? And she says that all her British guests never ever struggled to say what their greatest weakness is, and always struggled to say what their greatest strength is, because in Britain you're not supposed to admit that you have strengths.
So I wouldn't do well in Britain, given that I've given myself the moniker Dr. Good Looks. That would not be very British.
No, I don't think it would.
Well, you know what? Going back to self-deprecation for a second, so and linking it back, of course, to my interest in evolutionary theory, self-deprecation could be viewed as a costly signal in the biological sense, right? So costly signaling is the idea that in order for a signal to be honest, it must be costly to you. So the peacock's tail is because it is burdensome, because it makes you more likely to be picked up by the predators, then if I'm still wearing that big peacock's tail and I'm still around, then the peahens can be confident that I am a superior genetic stock because despite my tail, look at me, I'm standing. So to have the self-confidence to be self-deprecating is the ultimate measure of confidence, right? Because and if I can speak of myself, I can engage both in faux aggrandizing, if you've seen me on Twitter, or how I just did, right? Now, people don't get that. It's actually, I'm being, so for example, I will post a selfie at a beach and I'll say stupendous, sublime, sexy, and the beach is also nice. Now, most people will get that I'm doing this shtick, right? This self-aggrandizing shtick. But yet my haters will construe it as pathological narcissism. So they don't get this subtle interplay between self-deprecation, faux self-aggrandizing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, well, it's kind of part of the feature of the modern world as well, which is your haters don't want to understand what you're saying. They want to find a way to misinterpret it as badly as possible. And of course, a lot of people don't understand sarcasm. They don't understand irony. When this Sam Harris clip went super viral in the last few days, Francis and I, on one of our Raw shows, pretended to be upset that not enough people tagged us in the conversations about it because we get fake outraged about everything. It was the same video where I pretended to be outraged by my 3-month-old son not letting me sleep, because the funny thing is, like, how could you expect a 3-month-old? They don't have,
it's amazing.
They don't make conscious decisions, right? But people don't want to understand the irony, or maybe they're not capable. I don't know why. And so, yeah, I mean, look, the world is such now when people have the opportunity to misinterpret everything you say and do in the way that helps them, and it's not fair to what you're doing. But I think also you're right, actually, coming back to the self-deprecation and the comedy thing. I always said the most difficult thing to do and the thing that requires the most confidence on stage is to be self-deprecating. Because if people sense that the self-deprecation is real, as in you actually feel bad about being overweight, or you actually feel bad about your life being chaos, or whatever it is, or not being able to find a spouse, then they just feel sorry for you. So it has to be, you have to deliver these tragic truth bombs about your shitty life with a lot of confidence. Otherwise, people will just feel bad for you. So it's an interesting dynamic.
In my own context, I mean, as you know, I mean, I use humor and sarcasm and satire tons of times. It's a unique feature of my reality because I'm also, the fancy schmancy professor. And so the archetype of the professor should be that I'm always solemn. I always have a haughty air of profundity, right? I smoke a pipe while pontificating in the air because I'm better than you. I'm smarter than you. I am here. You're just a little rube. When you're funny, when you engage through your humor in a form of existential self-deprecation, right? I mean, it takes a lot of self-confidence, if I may say, to do the skits where I'm hiding under my desk, or to don a pink, wig and pretend that I'm ultra woke, or to literally self-flagellate myself. Now, a lot of the imbeciles and morons, some of whom are my colleagues, will write to me privately and say, well, you're the greatest, but why do you demean yourself through your humor? And I say, now I absolutely know that this person is a certified moron, because they don't appreciate what satire, but never mind, just humor is part of the rich tapestry of life. I'm a multifaceted being, right? If I am being interviewed right now about the evolutionary roots of morality, I'll be as professorial and austere as you might expect of that situation. But in other situations, as if humans have behavioral flexibility, I can be a joker and a buffoon. And it's so regrettable to me that I exist in a profession where to be always serious is to be profound. Whereas in your case, you don't really have that because you were a comedian. So at least you're allowed the opportunity to be funny. We expect that of you. But professors should never be funny.
Yeah, I think it's a very silly limitation that people will try to impose on your profession too. Because if you think about, as comedians, we think about punchlines. You're basically the way that the stand-up act works, particularly when you're starting out, is no one knows who you are, so there is no pre-existing buy-in. You go on stage and you're buying people's time with your jokes. So you go in, you say a joke, people go, okay, I'll give this guy another 5 seconds. You do another joke. Okay, maybe this guy's worth another 6 seconds. And over time, that's what you're doing. And so I sometimes do serious talks about some of the stuff that I cover in the book, about, the West and all of that. I always make sure to load that up with humor between the serious points, because I want you to know that another punchline is coming. And it may be coming 5 seconds from now, it may be coming 10 minutes from now, but here's a punchline so that you know another one is coming. And in between, I want to squeeze in the stuff that I actually want to communicate. And that, in my opinion, is a very powerful tool, whether you're a professor, a comedian, a YouTuber, whatever. Like, humor will buy you people's attention in a way that almost nothing else will.
Well, and it's funny because oftentimes when I'm, stopped on the streets by fans, I'm not sure if I should feel that it's a compliment or not, that typically they will refer to my funny tidbits more often than not. Oh my God, I love your self-flagellation routine, right? So they're not coming up to me and saying, I loved your hormonal analysis published in the paper Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. So it sticks, right? Comedy. Now, of course, behind it, there's a very serious intent, which is I'm trying to persuade you of an important message, right? So some of the most brilliant people in history have been famous satirists. And that's why, as you know, in the Soviet Union or anywhere else where you have dictators, the first people we have to get rid of are the people with the sharp tongues, not the guys with the big muscles. The guys with the big muscles are easy to handle. But the guy who, through a couple of well-placed words, can bring you down, that's the guy we have to eliminate.
Oh, 100%. And this is why I talk in An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. This is why I feel so passionately about the importance of being able to satirize both sides of the political spectrum and people in power, whether that power is political or cultural or whatever. Because I saw with my own eyes, we had in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a brilliant satirist called Viktor Shenderovich in Russia. He made an equivalent of what in the UK was called spitting image. These are puppets of politicians talking and having conversations. And this was the first time, obviously in my life, I was very young, but also in my parents' lives, and even in their parents' lives, 3 generations, the first time when they got to see their political leaders actually being made fun of. And it was incredible. And guess what? The moment Vladimir Putin came to power, the first thing he did, shut it down.
Beautiful. Exactly right. Okay, we're quickly hurling towards our meeting with Sam Harris. But before we do that, set the ground for us in terms of TRIGGERnometry. I mean, your platform has grown immensely. I mean, I remember the first time you had reached out to me when for me to come on the first time. If I compare where you were then to where you are now, I mean, it's unbelievable how it's grown. How did you get the idea to start it? How did you connect with Francis Foster? Give us the story, and then we'll delve into Sam Harris's show.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the brief summary then. So in April 2018, Francis and I, we were both comedians. We were playing many of the same clubs. He helped to run a comedy club where I was a regular, one of their regular performers. So we spent a bit of time together, and we sort of worked out, kind of like in the Soviet Union, like sort of, you're not on board with right? Yeah, and we sort of got that. And I had been watching a lot of people like you and others, having conversations about these things and thinking about these things myself, and realizing that, I'm not like the people in my industry. I don't like what's happening in my industry. I don't I'm not on board with it, and it's time for me to speak out about it, frankly. And I would not feel good if I was sitting quietly in the corner, as many comedians still do, and pretending that everything is fine. So I've seen the inspiration, and Joe Rogan was obviously having some of these conversations, and at the time I was a big fan of Dave Rubin's show. He's gone in his own direction since, which is.
Oh, let me stop you. I'm sensing kind of a disappointment, a tinge of disappointment in what you just said. Is that true? Did I pick that up correctly?
Not disappointment. It's less of the show that it was that I loved.
Got it.
Right? Dave has chosen a team, and he's on that team. And that's cool. People are allowed to be on the left team or the right team or the blue team or the red team. What I was fascinated by is what we are still trying to do with TRIGGERnometry, which is having conversations with different people from different sides from a place of inquisitiveness and curiosity. Yeah. And I still think that Dave has that, but I do think he's lent into his own opinions, yeah, which is cool for him, and he's entitled to do that. But what inspired me was the more curious and
gotcha.
Sort of, that's what I mean. I have nothing but love for Dave. He inspired me to do what I do. I wouldn't be where I am without him. His Locals platform is absolutely fantastic. For TRIGGERnometry, we use it very effectively.
Am I an utter moron for not having yet signed up on Locals?
I would never call the Godfather an utter moron, but I would recommend that you do. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm way late to the game. I agree.
Yeah, it works very well for us because it gives you a community vibe, yeah, as well as the support for you. So you can interact with people and they interact with each other. That's the thing. So you're building a community. So yeah, Dave's cool. But what I'm saying is, what we wanted to do is, people often think that the way to be successful or to do something that you want to do is to look at what other people are doing and to imitate that. And that is a surefire way to fail, yeah, because no one wants to watch the second best or the 10th best Joe Rogan show or the whatever. People want to see something that's authentic. So when Francis and I started TRIGGERnometry, we thought, well, look, one of the most important things is you've got to give people space to speak, and Joe does that brilliantly. You've got to invite interesting people, obviously, but also, one of the things we looked at, the way that Dave did, is he had a more condensed and a more focused interview, and the visual presentation was always on point, right? It looked good, and I always thought that was very important. So we pulled a few pieces together, and then we added our own, which is we felt it was really important to sweeten the pill of intellectual discussion with humor and comedy and lightness too. The final pieces, I think neither Francis or I pretend to be anything that we're not. The currency of the internet is authenticity, and Francis would say that he's sort of the voice of the working person, the ordinary person. He doesn't pretend to be an intellectual, whereas I am more interested in ideas and the intellectual conversations. And so that combination together means that when we're talking to a guest like you, we get some of the intellectual stuff, but we also get some of the what would a guy in the pub having a pint want to ask Gad Saad? You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's been the formula that really works for us.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right, so let's come to the Sam Harris part. And as I promised off air, and as I always do with all my guests, it'll be very, very polite, very respectful. Our goal here is not to badmouth Sam Harris or any such thing, but rather it was a very, very powerful conversation. And actually one of the rare ones where I actually went back, and because at first I only saw the snippets, the viral stuff, which everybody was tagging me on, knowing that I'd probably have something to say about it. And then I said, you know what, let's see if it's taken out of context or not. So I owe it to Sam before I take a position to kind of watch everything, which I did. Fantastic interview. You guys really handled it with grace and majesty. So before I give you my position, which you may have seen in a clip that I released, it was a short clip. Give us your take on the entire thing. Take it wherever you want to go.
Well, I don't know where to start. So first of all, I'm very annoyed that despite the viralness of the clips, people haven't watched the full interview, because Sam, other than the Trump stuff, which we can set aside and talk about separately, it's actually a fabulous interview.
Yes.
And what Sam says about social media, what Sam says about the religion of wokeness, what Sam says about how to be a more contented and happy human being, which is the majority of the interview. And on our locals, we have some paywalled content, which is bonus questions from our fans for Sam. That stuff is really good as well. There's a robust discussion about vaccines where him and I particularly have a very different point of view. And there's some other stuff that we talk about, which is, in a world which is overflowing with information, how do we manage that as human beings? So first of all, I'm frustrated by the fact that not enough people, for my liking, have done what you did and went and watched the actual interview. Because setting the Trump stuff aside, it's actually a great conversation. I really like Sam. He was an incredibly nice person to be around. He was very generous with his time. We had some tech difficulties. We booked him for an hour. We started nearly an hour late, and he gave us another 2 hours of his time, which is, for a guy who is as busy and as in demand as he is incredibly generous. And he was very, very nice. In terms of the Trump stuff, this is where I learned something from Joe Rogan, because when we were on his show, I asked him about a conversation. I don't know if you're into boxing, Gad.
Not much.
So much.
Yeah.
Not much. Well, he had a guest on who used to be one of Mike Tyson's trainers. I'm sure you know who Mike Tyson is.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And this guy who used to train Mike Tyson was bad-mouthing Mike Tyson on Joe's show and saying that Mike Tyson never won a fight. He beat people who were worse than him by a long way, but every time he was in a fight, in a dogfight, he lost every time. That's what he was saying. And Joe let him speak for like 20 minutes about this, and then they had a conversation. And I said to Joe, how did you handle this? You've got a guy you like and respect who is bad-mouthing one of the greatest boxers in the world's history, who you also like and respect, and he's doing it on your show. And he said, well, I let him express himself. That's the most important thing. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that the conversation went the way that it went with Sam is that he was allowed to express his views. And that's really important, because I think in almost every other interview, he would have been interrupted after a few seconds with people jumping down his throat.
So can I interrupt you right there, since you mentioned?
Of course.
So you're speaking about the value of the procedural details of how to conduct an optimal interview, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. But
I was getting there.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So forgive me for interrupting you. Okay.
But what Joe also said after he answered my question about how to be an interviewer is, I don't agree with what this guy said, I think I make it very clear what my view is in the conversation that we have with Sam. I don't agree. Whether he said it in this way or not. Let me say positively what I believe. I believe that the most important thing in a democracy is that both sides of the political spectrum are treated equally. I think that is the most important thing. And the moment that stops being the case, the path to the destruction of that society and that democracy is very clear to me.
Yes.
So to me, the idea that we would overlook the corruption or the dishonesty or the shenanigans of one side because the other side is worse, to me, that is against my principles.
Yes.
I don't believe that either side has a right to conspire together in whatever way they can to prevent the other side from winning in a way that's unfair. That is not. I don't support that idea, and I certainly, feel very strongly that is the wrong way to approach this, which I made clear to Sam in our conversation.
So let me rephrase what you said in a slightly different way, and this is kind of a summary of what I put out a clip a few days ago that was very short, 3-4 minutes, but really got to the point. I'm going to summarize those points. So in the field of ethics, there's a distinction between two types of ethical bents. There's what's called deontology or consequentialism. Deontological statements would be, it is never okay to lie. It's an absolute truth that is inviolable. Okay. Consequentialism is when my partner, my wife, my spouse asks me, do I look fat in those jeans? Then I put on my consequentialist hat and I say, of course not. Why? Because I'd like to remain married, and I'm telling a white lie so that I can spare someone's feelings. Now, for most things in life, we all tend to oscillate between these two systems. For many, many things in daily social dynamics, we are consequentialists, and that's perfectly fine. But when you're talking about the foundational values that define the beauty of our Western cultures, those foundational principles are fully, unequivocally deontological. So, for example, presumption of innocence is a principle that doesn't only apply to the people that we really care about and respect. It applies to Brett Kavanaugh. So when someone says he has been a gang rapist going up and down the Eastern Board, I don't exactly remember it. It happened 40 years ago. It may have happened. It may not have happened. But, it's too serious to allow this guy to become a justice, because we can't afford him presumption of innocence, because after all, this is not a jury case. It's not a criminal case. It's just a job interview. Well, it's okay if Donald Trump is taken off the platform, because sure, freedom of speech is important, but ultimately this is a private company, and anyways, we should not be giving freedom of speech to those that we know are asteroids catapulting all the way to Earth. So there was a constant, repetitive, not only on your show, but in the 5-6 years since Trump came to offer, where Sam, who is a philosopher, who is a bright man, who is a moral man, has violated the most fundamental principle that deontological principles can never be violated. So what I did in my case, I will interject myself into the situation. I like Sam a lot. I've had dinner with Sam. He was a friend of mine. There is nothing personal. I don't care about personal things because we're not such good friends that we're calling each other every day. But we've had a very positive interaction through the years. He's invited me on his show. For 4 or 5 years, I sat quietly while he went hysterical. And not just hysterical. I don't care if he's hysterical. But once you're violating values that really matter to me in the defense of the West, then I started feeling inauthentic in not speaking out against him, right? Because I was now torn between two systems. One, my loyalty and commitment to people whom I know. Therefore, I don't want to be making fun of them publicly and so on. So I kept my mouth shut for 4 or 5 years. But then I'm also committed to the truth. And therefore, I have to speak out. Just because, you could be my father and you could say stupid stuff. And I'm going to have to intervene because truth is more important than my relationship to my father. And so I very tepidly and playfully, a while ago, about a year ago, did 1 or 2 sarcastic things where I was ribbing on Sam precisely because of his hysteria. I hid under the table, Donald Trump and so on, Malibu meditator. Now, someone who, in my view, would have reacted properly would be, haha, God, you got me. Hey, come on my show. Why don't I come on your show and let's debate whether my consequentialism is correct or whether your deontologic perspective is the correct one. But instead what he did, he blocked me. Now the morons say, oh, Gad is upset because he blocked him. I couldn't give a shit. I've got a great wife, a great house, a best-selling book. I'm healthy. I've got great children. Sam is number 187 on my list of I care about. But what to me it says, and I know it puts you in a difficult position because he was a guest of yours and so on, what to me it says is precisely what I talk about the parasitic mind, which is you can take someone as educated as Sam, as lovely as Sam, as sweet as Sam, but once we find the idea pathogen that he is weak to, in this case Trump, then he can be parasitized, right? And that to me is disappointing because otherwise the list of great qualities of Sam are truly quite long. And so I feel sorry that it has gotten to this. Sorry to be long-winded.
No. I hear you. I don't look. I cannot possibly know the nature of your relationship with Sam, who said what, how it went down, or whatever. However, here's what I would say, and this isn't in defense of Sam. It's more in defense of me, because I sometimes block people who behave towards me in a similar way as you've described you were behaving towards Sam. I'm not saying it's the same because I don't know the nature of your relationship. However, here's how I think about Twitter, right? I'm a public person to some extent. You are a public person to some extent. To me, Twitter is my workplace, okay? So when I go on Twitter, it's essentially me going into the office. Now, if I had a friend 5 or 6 years ago with whom we'd fallen out over something or disagreed over something or simply went our separate ways, and then 5 years down the line, I said something that he profoundly disagreed with, if I went to the office every day and this guy was at the door going, here's, talking to all the people in the street about how I'm an idiot. I'm not saying you said that, but I'm exaggerating.
Sure,
right?
sure.
I consider, like, if somebody was standing in my office every day talking to a bunch of people about how wrong I am about a certain issue, like, I'd be like, well, you're entitled to that view, but do I have to listen to it every day when I come to work?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So from my perspective, and look, this has happened to me. You said sarcastic. I call it a bit of trolling. Like during the COVID thing, for example, Claire Lehman and I had a bit of a thing. And eventually she blocked me. And I didn't like that she blocked me. But as I thought about it later, I was like, I can totally see that there was a large number of people making fun of her, having a go at her. She saw me as one of those people. She blocked me. Thankfully, Claire is someone who has the decency to eventually later reach out to me. We cleaned it up. We're in touch, etc. But my point is this: like, I think this idea that someone blocked you, therefore it means this. It's a little bit of a leap of logic. It's not necessarily that. Like Sam, right, for the last few days is going through something that is deeply unpleasant. I don't care how much you meditate, right? Yeah. When you've got millions of people around the world saying you're the worst thing and blah, 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 it's difficult. And so if you see people, particularly people who were friends of yours with whom you were in touch, you may not be right that they are doing so unfairly, but you may see them as part of this big mob of people who are attacking you, many of whom are attacking you unfairly. They're not doing what Gad Saad may have been doing, which is saying, here is where your argument is flawed. Yeah. A lot of them are saying, you're the worst person that's ever lived, and I hope you die.
And actually, it's funny because I was reading some of those comments on Twitter, and at first I was going to reply to some of them in defense of Sam, right? Saying, you could disagree with his stuff, as I did very politely and respectfully in the clip that I released, without calling him. I even have a friend of mine whom you may know, Nassim Taleb, the Lebanese author, who has gone after Sam, in the past in ways that I at the time found quite rough. Like, right, you're a charlatan, you're a fraud. You don't have to use this language, right? So in my case, I was simply commenting about the content of what you said, right? And I made sure to preface it by saying, Sam has many great qualities. I really like Sam. So to me, look, it's not a personal saga, but to me, it's a teachable moment, right? If Sam ever listens to this conversation, he is going to come across as he will immediately rehabilitate anything that he may have lost if he says, you know what, I've thought about what persons XYZ said, and in retrospect, maybe they could have been right on this, because then that shows intellectual humility. If you are so dogmatic as it seems as though you are impenetrable to possible counting arguments, then it's exactly the things that we make fun of, the echo chambers.
But Gad, you're too clever for your own good. You got to remember, people are also emotional beings. True. Right? There is intellectual, which is what you're talking about, and that is what you've been trained in as an academic. Yeah. And there's also the personal. Now, of course, I hear you. Sam is an eminent philosopher, and so yes, you'd expect him to be. But human beings are human beings, and so when you are attacked by hundreds of thousands of people, it's probably quite difficult to go and watch every video and to go, well, Gad Saad, who the comments under whose videos are attacking me as a person, he was actually quite fair and balanced about this issue. So it's not as simple. And look, rather than talking about the personal stuff, I actually, it's something interesting that I've been thinking about a lot in this context. And I am not saying that this is what's happened with Sam, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because this comes back to the point of, are we emotional beings or are we rational beings, or are we a bit of both, which of course we are. I think I come from a very intellectual family. Both my parents are high-level biochemical engineers. My grandfather, the one who had to flee the Soviet Union, he was an eminent physicist, astrophysicist.
Nice.
I come from a family of people who've trained themselves and therefore everyone around them to be super rational. And one of the things that I think is a downside of this hyper-rationality is that I am this rational person, right? I am not driven by emotion. I am rational. Everything I think is a product of my rational mind. And then when you've got an emotional reaction to something, whether that's Brexit or Trump or COVID or Saad or Konstantin, Kisin or whatever, you've been trained from the age of 3 that you're not allowed to have an emotional reaction. Your reaction must be rational.
Yeah.
And so if I hate this person and I have an emotional reaction, I must cloak this in the mantle of rationality. And I think that's where intellectual people, like all of us, not just Sam and me and you, but all of us, we sometimes allow our emotions to sort of, like, they slip under the bonnet of what is, of what is ostensibly a rational argument about somebody that we dislike. And that to me is a valuable part of this conversation, both for you, for me, and for Sam.
Yeah, I love that you talked about the supposed schism between emotions and thinking, and feeling versus rationality, because as you may remember in chapter 2 of the Parasitic Mind, the entire chapter is on thinking versus feeling. And there, so let me repeat it because it is perfectly apropos to what we're talking about here. What I argued in that chapter is that it is incorrect to pit the two systems against one another. It's not that academics should be rational and not be swayed by their emotions, or that man is thinking and not feeling. We are absolutely both, and there are clear evolutionary reasons why we would have evolved a very attuned cognitive and an emotional system. The challenge, Konstantin, is when to activate the right system, so that right. So when I'm walking down a dark alley because I'm taking a shortcut to get home, and my affective system picks up, my heartbeat goes up, my blood pressure goes up, I start perspiring because I see 4 young men loitering, that emotional response was perfectly rational, right? The emotion was rational, right? On the other hand, if I'm trying to solve a astrophysics problem in an exam, then all of the triggering of my emotional system is not going to allow me to solve it. So in the case of Sam, and many in the intelligentsia, when it comes to Donald Trump, what's happened to them is that they have allowed their emotional system to completely hijack their thinking, right? So, so Donald...
May I interrupt
please,
very briefly?
Please.
I don't disagree with you about, what people call Trump derangement syndrome, and I do think that's true. I'm just saying that from the reason I think this happens is not so much that they're hijacked, but rather they have a different view of the problem, which is they see their country, quote unquote, going down the dark alley. Yeah. Right? And so their emotional reaction kicks in. And for some of them, I'm not saying this is the case for Sam, it may or may not be, the emotional reaction kicks in because the country's going down a dark alley. And then they rationalize the emotion.
Of course.
And present it as a rational argument, even though those of us who are maybe not affected or don't see it in that way don't then feel that this is appropriate.
Right.
So I think that's what may be happening with some people.
Absolutely. What I'm about to say next applies not only to Sam, but to the intelligentsia in general, because when I wrote that chapter in The Parasitic Mind, it was much, much bigger than one particular individual. I didn't even have Sam Harris in mind. I was talking about how the intelligentsia responded to Donald Trump, right? So actually, by coincidence, let me mention a situation that happened when I appeared on Sam's show before Donald Trump was elected. Because at the time, he was already arguing in public that anybody who could potentially vote for Donald Trump is an absolute maniac. I mean, that has no humanity. Every single one. As a matter of fact, on your show, he reiterated that, whereby he gave one exemption to a single individual out of nearly 80 million people who voted for him. Do you remember who that individual is?
I don't actually.
Peter Thiel. He
Right.
said, Peter Thiel, whom I know well, might be the only guy that I can I'm paraphrasing what he said, right? So out of 80 million people, 79,999,999 were complete degenerates. They only sleep with their sister. They're toothless bigots. And
That part I don't remember him saying.
well, I'm adding to it, right? He said he cannot believe, right? So that gets my goat, right? Not because it's Sam Harris, but because I abhor that kind of dehumanization of the other. You know, we're great in Germany, but if only we can get rid of this really serious problem called the Jews. And now this is rational. We just need to get rid of the parasites. If we get rid of this other group, then it will all be kumbaya. So when someone with Sam Harris's prestige and intelligence can repeatedly say that it's impossible for him to have the theory of mind that can understand how any rational person could vote for Donald Trump, then I'm going to say, wait a minute, whatever friendship I had with you is superseded by me having to intervene and say, that's an insane statement. I even gave an explanation based in psychology of decision making on how perfectly rational people could vote for Trump. Let me repeat it for you here, Konstantin. There is a decision rule called the lexicographic rule, which basically says whenever you're choosing between multi-attribute choices, Clinton versus Trump, you only look at your most important attribute and choose the alternative that scores higher on that attribute. So for example, if for me immigration is my most important attribute, even if on every other attribute Hillary Clinton crushed Donald Trump, I will never look at that information. I will only look at immigration policy. Since Trump scores higher, in my view, rightly or wrongly, on immigration, I will vote for him. So I just gave you a very clear cognitive path by which perfectly rational people who apply the lexicographic rule can vote for Donald Trump. I explained this to Sam Harris very calmly so he can get it. And then for the next 5 years, everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a bigot and a toothless incest, whatever.
Well, look, nobody in this conversation, I think, agrees with the idea that everyone who voted for Donald Trump is evil or a moron. I certainly don't hold that view, which is why I let Sam express his point of view and then challenged him pretty robustly on it.
You did.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm with you. I think I don't want to. We can get into Trump. We probably don't have the time.
Sure.
But yeah. So from my perspective, I just think the most important thing for me, I will say this, first and foremost, was to reach out to Sam and make sure he's okay.
Yes.
Because when you are, in the eye of the storm like that, the way that he was, it's always difficult. And he was very, very gracious and actually congratulated us on doing a good job. So nice. I'm glad he's okay. That to me was the most important thing in all of this, no matter what he said.
And let me add my official well wishes. There is zero, at least from my part, there is zero animus from me towards Sam. Zero. Nothing.
I'm glad to hear it.
Zip. My only concern is with some of the ideas that he espoused. It begins and ends there, period. So there we go. All right, let's talk about, let's move on from Trump and all that kind of good stuff before I know we have to wrap it up soon. You've been very kind with your time. What are the next projects? Okay, so you wrote that first great book. Are there any other books in mind? Do you have a 3-year plan, 5-year plan, 10-year plan for you? Tell us whatever you'd like to share in terms of that kind of issue.
Well, we just did a trip to the US, obviously, where we recorded Sam and a bunch of people. We've got my favorite comedian, Bill Burr, as one of our interviews. A bunch of other great guests, Adam Carolla, a few comics we got in New York, etc. So lots of great interviews coming out, first of all. The second thing is, out of the trip to the US, we realized just how much cool stuff there's going on over there, and we were going to go more I was going to say more regularly. That was our first trip ever, so we're going to go for short periods of time, and maybe next year, I mean, Joe Rogan was very kind, and he was sort of suggesting that we should move over to Austin to be there with all the cool stuff that's happening, and we may do that for a couple of months a year and just see how we like it,
Wow.
and take it from there. But we're going to be a British show for the foreseeable future. I haven't, writing a book with the sort of intense schedule that I have at the moment wasn't easy the first time, and now my son is here as well. It's even more of a challenge. So I'm going to take my time before thinking of the next one. Right now, it's all about trigonometry, which, as you rightly say, is really taken off in the last couple of years. You've got a team of 10 people that works with us now, and we're building and building and building all the time.
Wow.
So that's my focus right now. I want us to be the sort of the Joe Rogan of Europe, if you like. That's how we often think about it, to be the place for all these conversations where we can speak to Sam Harris and hear his view on Trump, and then speak to you and hear your view on Trump, and then speak to whoever. Our slogan has always been honest conversations with fascinating people, and that's really, to me, the antidote to many of the things that are happening in society now. We have to bring honesty and a willingness to talk about difficult ideas back to the table, and that's why, for all my disagreement with what Sam said about Trump, I'm really grateful to him for coming on the show. And here's why, Gad, as well. This is really important too. It's not like Sam Harris is the one guy that thinks what he thinks about Trump. There are other people who think that. And I don't know, are they going to be persuaded by the response that his comments received, that maybe they've gone a bit far? I don't know. Maybe they will be more entrenched as a result. It's hard for me to tell. But I do think we should at least be speaking honestly about what we believe. And Sam is, the first person I've heard make that case that you and I both disagree with.
Right.
I think it's important, as we know, the first step to solving a problem is admitting there is one. And I think part of the problem that we have to admit to ourselves is we're sort of constantly having these fake conversations. And we'd like on Trigonometry to actually have the honest conversation and be a space where people can say what they think. And that's why I say my first concern was for Sam's well-being, because I want people like him to be able to come on the show and say what he said. I think we're better off with him being able to say that thing that lots of people disagree with than everybody just hides and pretends that they don't actually think what they think.
Perfectly stated. Last question, and then stay on the line. I'll tell you goodbye offline. Probably the most important question of this chat. Are you a soccer fan?
Yes.
Okay, so therefore this will be the most important question, and it will determine whether we can continue our friendship or whether it ends right here. Who is your favorite British team?
Everton.
Only because they suck. I'm going to maintain our friendship. If you would have said one of those annoying teams like Manchester United or Liverpool, I'm a Manchester City guy. Let me tell you why. Not because they're champions, because
sure.
honestly, because I'm into tiki-taka. I'm into Kevin De Bruyne. I think if Kevin De Bruyne were to come around, I might leave my wife for him. And I'm not into same-sex attraction. I mean, I think the way the guy plays, he drives me crazy. It's out of this world. But okay, Everton, you want to tell us quickly why before we say goodbye?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. I came to the UK in 1995, which was the year Andrei Kanchelskis, who was the only Russian/Ukrainian player in the Premier League at the time, he had moved from Manchester United to Everton. And if it hadn't been for that, I might actually have been supporting a team that's any good this whole time.
But what loyalty that you anchored in that position. It speaks to the fact that we don't anchor away. Once we commit, are we committed. 27 years later, you're still an Everton fan. Good for you. What a pleasure it is to talk to you. Onward and upward. I'm sure that your channel is only going to continue to grow. Thank you so much for coming on, Konstantin, and I'll talk to you soon. And let me just remind people, don't forget to go out immediately after listening to this chat. An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. It's a good one. Read it. Thank you so much, Konstantin.
Thanks, Gad. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Stay on the line.